This is your tech news briefing for Thursday, February 16th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. In the coming days, Canadian lawmakers are expected to pass a law that forces digital platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Netflix to showcase more Canadian content. The country already has similar rules for television and radio. But there's a big catch. A lot of Canadian content makers don't support the change. Here's Vanessa Brusso, who, as of Wednesday, had just shy of 127,000 followers on TikTok.
I see it as control, and I don't think it's needed in a world that we live in today that we're so accessible all over the world.
Joining us from Ottawa is Wall Street Journal reporter Paul Vieira. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Nice to see you.
Can you give us a little background on this law? What specifically would it require platforms to do?
Because Canada lives right next door to the United States, there's always been a concern that Canadian artists, Canadian programming, Canadian songs would get shut out by the more popular US programming. So dating back to the 60s, Canada's had rules to ensure that Canadian artists could get their shows on the air, their music on the radio. And it was all about promoting Canadian stories and having venues where Canadians can tell Canadian stories. Now they want that to apply online, given the growing popularity of streaming services and digital platforms.
You've been speaking with some creators who use these platforms like YouTube or TikTok. How do they feel about this law?
There's kind of a divide here in Canada. We have, for instance, media producers, people who produce TV shows and movies and such, who like this law. And then you have the new Canadian digital artists. These are people who upload material up on YouTube, TikTok, what have you. And they've been able now to eke a living on these new platforms because the algorithms, they argue, have allowed their content to reach people who have an interest in their stuff. What they worry about is the new rules are going to force the platforms like YouTube, for instance, to rewrite their algorithms. And there's a concern that Canadian content is going to be sent to Canadian internet users who don't really have an interest in that. So the artists' material are going to get fewer clicks, and then that's going to deprioritize them on the algorithm rankings. So the digital artists here argue that they're going to, in fact, get fewer viewers globally for their work if there's fewer clicks here in Canada. And it should be noted that YouTube has said that the proposed changes will force them to rewrite their algorithms, and we'll see what happens with that.
Can you tell us specifically about some of the content creators that you've talked to? I mean, what kind of audiences do they have now? Who are they attracting as their viewers?
You know, I spoke, for instance, to a stand-up comedian who used to do the clubs in Canada, and because of his TikTok following, he's now got a US tour lined up. And he says he would never have gotten that kind of audience just waiting for Canadian television to air his stuff. I spoke to a South Asian mother in her 40s who on TikTok has provided videos of her attempts to learn skateboarding. She says she's got a pretty big global following, and that's helped her secure marketing deals. She's worried that the changes are going to pose a risk to growing her global audience. I spoke to an Indigenous woman who does not want the Canadian label, and she's worried about her audience also not growing.
So that's the perspective from the content creators. How do the platforms feel about these rules?
Officials for YouTube and TikTok spent a lot of time in Ottawa, Canada's capital, to try to persuade policymakers, lawmakers not to go ahead, and warning of the repercussions. Part of their argument was that they're going to hurt the actual artists they're attempting to help. Netflix, Disney, other streaming platforms were also in Ottawa trying to make the case, but their argument was a bit different as they were looking for a more flexible definition of Canadian content. They argue the rules right now produce some head scratchers. You know, that, for instance, the streamers, especially Netflix and Disney, are pouring a lot of money into Canada, producing TV shows and movies with Canadian crews and Canadian settings, and yet they're not considered Canadian content because the rights are owned by a foreign company, i.e. American.
We have seen these rules in place for Canadian broadcasters, for TV, for radio. Is there a feeling that they helped foster a Canadian marketplace for those outlets?
Music is a rather interesting example because those Canadian content rules for radio came into place in the 1970s. Some music historians will tell you that some substandard content was aired for a while, but at the same time, it's helped create this ecosystem that allowed Canadian artists to get their songs played, create a following, and then create a following in the US. The same applies for TV. We had shows like SCTV, Second City Television, Kids in the Hall, and of course, most recently, Schitt's Creek. There was an ecosystem in place, and because of Canadian content rules, ecosystems were allowed to flourish and then led to the production of these shows that later on became hits in the US and globally. So there is an argument that these rules have helped the domestic industry, and there's also an argument that these rules have also been good economic policy in terms of allowing for growth of the performing arts sector in this country.
What's the global picture for this? Are other countries considering similar rules, taking similar steps?
This is a really good question. The platforms are worried that if Canada goes ahead with these plans, these proposals, and they're finalized and implemented, the big worry is that individual countries will now start to copy them. And that's going to force platforms, be it streaming companies, YouTube, TikTok, it's going to force them to write all sorts of algorithms for individual countries. And then that sort of poses a problem for their business model.
All right, that's our reporter, Paul Vieira. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thank you, Zoe.
And that's it for today's Tech News Briefing. If you want more tech stories, check out our website, WSJ.com. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for listening.